I never thought a small piece of paper could ruin a perfectly good Tuesday. But then again, I spent 40 years as a senior bank auditor. I know that the biggest collapses usually start with a single decimal point out of place, or a signature that looks just a little too smooth. It was 10 in the morning. I was in the kitchen, finishing my second cup of black coffee. The house was quiet. My daughter, Sarah, was out running errands. Her husband, Mark, was at his law firm downtown, being the big-shot real estate attorney everyone in this town seems to love. That left me alone with the mail. I like to stay busy. Being 68 doesn't mean your brain stops working. I still keep my own ledgers. I still track every nickel that goes in and out of my retirement account. And most importantly, I track the trust fund I set up for my grandson, Leo. Leo is 10 years old. He is a good kid. He likes baseball and he likes sitting in the garage with me while I tinker with old clocks. I missed a lot of Sarah's childhood because I was always at the bank, buried in spreadsheets. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake with Leo. That trust fund is his future. It is college. It is a down payment on a house. It is the one thing I can do to make sure his life is steady. I was sorting through a stack of junk mail when I saw it. A yellow window envelope from the bank. It was a return to sender notice. Now, that shouldn't have been in our mailbox. That notice was addressed to me, Arthur Miller, but the mailing address on the form wasn't this house. It was a post office box across town. A box I didn't recognize. I sat down at the kitchen table. My back gave a little crack. A reminder of too many years sitting in office chairs. I opened the envelope carefully. I don't rip things. I use a letter opener. Habits die hard. Inside was a standard notification from the bank regarding Leo's trust account. It said they had tried to mail the quarterly statement to the new address on file, but the delivery had failed. The new address on file. I felt a small, cold ripple in my chest. I never changed the address on that account. I set it up 5 years ago using my home address. I wanted the statements coming here, to my desk, where I could file them away. I looked at the form again. The change of address request had been processed 3 months ago. The signature at the bottom was mine. Or at least, it looked like mine. It had that same sharp tilt on the letter A and the long tail on the R, but I knew I hadn't signed it. When you spend 4 decades looking at fraudulent checks and forged loan documents, you develop a sense for these things. It is like a smell. Something was off. I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was Sarah's SUV. I quickly folded the notice and slid it under a stack of newspapers. I didn't want to upset her, not yet. Sarah is a soft soul. She believes the best of everyone, especially Mark. She came through the back door, carrying 2 bags of groceries. She looked tired, but she smiled when she saw me. She always does. "Hey Dad," she said. "You still working on those old bills?" "Just tidying up, honey," I told her. I got up to help her with the bags. "Where is the boy?" "Leo is at practice," she said, leaning against the counter. "Mark is picking him up on his way home." Mark is so good about that. Even with his schedule, he never misses a chance to be the hero. She said it with pride. She really loves him. Mark Sterling is the man who saved her, or so the story goes. He came along 10 years ago, a hungry young lawyer with $1 million smile and a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He is the kind of guy who shakes your hand a little too firm and calls you sir every chance he gets. I watched her put the milk away. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "did we get any mail about Leo's trust lately?" I noticed the statement was a few days late. She didn't even look up from the fridge. "Oh, Mark handles all of that now, Dad. Remember, he said he wanted to move everything to his office so his clerks could keep the tax records organized for us. He told me he talked to you about it back in January." I felt a pulse in my neck. Mark had never mentioned it to me. Not once. We had dinner together every Sunday. We sat on the porch and talked about the Yankees. He had plenty of chances to tell me he was moving my grandson's money to his law firm's address. "Did he now?" I said. My voice sounded steady. That was the auditor in me. Never let the client know you found the missing money until you have the proof in your hand. "Yeah," Sarah continued, finally looking at me. "Is everything okay? You look a little flushed." "I am fine," I said, forcing a small smile. "Just the coffee. I think I'll go for a walk. I need some air." I walked out of the house and down the block. The neighborhood was quiet. The lawns were mowed. Everything looked perfect. But I couldn't stop thinking about that signature. If Mark had changed the address, why did he forge my name to do it? We are family. He could have just asked. He is a lawyer. He knows that signing someone else's name on a bank document is a felony. Unless he didn't want me to know. I walked 3 blocks before I stopped at a park bench. I took the notice out of my pocket and looked at it again. This wasn't a mistake. This was a move. A move made by a man who thinks he is smarter than the man sitting on this bench. Mark thinks I am just an old retiree who likes to fix clocks and watch the grass grow. He thinks I am past my prime. He thinks I am not paying attention anymore. But he is wrong. I know how banks work. I know how people hide things. You don't take it all at once. You take a little bit. You move the mail so the owner doesn't see the balance dropping. You wait for the old man to get a little more confused, a little more tired. I stood up and started walking back toward the house. My legs felt stronger than they had in months. The suspicion was there, sharp and clear. It was a feeling I hadn't had since my last big audit before I retired. It was the feeling of a hunter who just found a drop of blood on the trail. Mark is a lawyer. He knows the law. But I am an auditor. I know the math. And in the end, the math is the only thing that matters. I needed to see those statements. I needed to see exactly where Leo's money was going. And I knew exactly where Mark kept his files. The question wasn't just about the money anymore. The question was why a perfect son-in-law would risk everything to lie to an old man. I went back inside. The house smelled like the roast Sarah was starting for dinner. It smelled like a happy home. But as I looked at the stairs leading up to Mark's private office, I knew the harmony was over. I am a patient man. I can wait for the right moment. But once I start an audit, I never stop until the books are balanced. And right now the numbers were screaming. I spent 40 years of my life inside the four walls of a bank. Most people think auditing is about finding math errors, but that is not true. It is about finding the lie. It is about spotting the moment a man decides he can take what belongs to someone else. I have seen it 1,000 times. I have seen honest men crumble under debt, and I have seen greedy men sleep like babies. I retired 6 years ago. I thought I was done with the lies. I wanted a quiet life in this house, the one I paid off back in 1998. I wanted to watch my grandson Leo grow up. I wanted to be the father to my daughter, Sarah, that I never quite managed to be when I was chasing a vice presidency. In my working days, I was rarely home. Sarah grew up seeing the back of my head while I leaned over spreadsheets at the kitchen table. I provided for her. I gave her the best of everything, but I did not give her my time. That is the kind of debt you can never really pay back. When she married Mark Sterling, I thought my debt was settled. Mark was everything I was not. He was loud, confident, and he didn't seem to have a single shadow in his life. He was a real estate lawyer who knew everyone in the county. He treated Sarah like she was made of glass. He called me dad from the second year they were together. I trusted him. For 10 years, I trusted him with my daughter's happiness. And 5 years ago, I trusted him with Leo's future. I set up a trust fund for Leo on the day he turned 5. It was a substantial amount. It was my legacy, the fruit of 40 years of saying no to vacations and driving the same Buick for a decade. I made Mark the co-trustee because he was the lawyer in the family. He knew the tax codes. He knew the legalities. I was the money man, and he was the paper man. It was a perfect partnership. Or so I thought. But that return to sender notice from the bank changed everything. It sat on my nightstand for 2 days like a ticking clock. On Thursday afternoon, the opportunity I was looking for finally arrived. Sarah had taken Leo to a birthday party at a trampoline park 2 towns over. Mark had mentioned he had a closing at the courthouse that would run late. The house was empty. It was cold gray and silent. I stood at the bottom of the stairs. My heart was thumping in my chest, a heavy, dull rhythm. I felt like a thief in my own home. But as I looked at the framed photo on the hallway table, a picture of Leo at his last baseball game, the guilt vanished. My job is to protect that boy. It always has been. I walked up to Mark's home office. It is a nice room. High ceilings, leather chairs, and the smell of expensive tobacco. It is the room of a man who wants you to know he has arrived. I sat down at his desk. Mark is a creature of habit, just like I am. I have watched him log into his computer 100 times while we were watching games or drinking a beer. He thinks I am just an old man who doesn't understand technology. He thinks I am looking at the coaster under my drink, when I am actually watching his fingers move across the keyboard. 1205, Leo's birthday. That was his password. He used the boy's birthday to guard his secrets. That felt like a slap in the face. The screen flickered to life. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my neck. I am 68 years old, and I was hacking into my son-in-law's computer. I went straight for the accounting folders. Mark keeps a personal ledger, a habit he probably picked up from me. I found the file labeled Family Trust. My hands were steady now. This was my territory. I know how to read a balance sheet better than I know how to read my own daughter's moods. I opened the folder and looked at the primary account for Leo's trust. The opening balance from 3 years ago was exactly where it should have been. $500,000. I had watched that number grow with interest for a long time. Then I started looking at the disbursements. My eyes moved down the column. At first it looked normal. Small management fees. A few $100s here and there for administrative costs. But then, 14 months ago, the pattern changed. There was a wire transfer for $50,000. The recipient was listed as North Star Holdings. I frowned. I had never heard of North Star. I checked the memo line. It just said investment capital. I kept scrolling. 2 months later, another $50,000. Then $80,000. Then a massive lump sum of $120,000 just last October. I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. I did the math in my head. I didn't even need a calculator. $300,000 was gone. More than half of my grandson's future had been drained away in less than a year and a half. I clicked on the details for North Star Holdings. I looked for an address, a phone number, a tax ID. Nothing, it was a ghost. I sat back in the leather chair. The silence of the house felt heavy now. I thought about all those Sunday dinners. I thought about Mark sitting at my table, eating the food Sarah cooked, laughing at my jokes, and telling me how well the trust was doing. He had looked me in the eye every single week while he was moving 60% of that money into a black hole. This wasn't an error. This wasn't a bad investment. As an auditor, you learn to see the intent behind the numbers. A bad investment is a single event. This was a series of deliberate, calculated moves. This was a man who was carefully peeling back the layers of a family's security, hoping no one would notice until there was nothing left but the skin. I thought about Sarah. If I told her right now, it would destroy her. She worships him. She thinks he is the rock this family is built on. She wouldn't believe the numbers. She would believe the man who kisses her forehead every morning. And I thought about Leo. That boy thinks his father is a hero. He thinks Mark is the strongest man in the world. I looked at the screen one last time. North Star Holdings. It sounds like something solid, something you can use to find your way home. But I knew better. In the world of finance, a name that sounds that perfect is usually a mask for something very ugly. I closed the folders. I cleared the browser history. I made sure the mouse was exactly where it had been when I sat down. I walked out of the room and closed the door softly. My knees felt a little weak as I walked back down the stairs. I am an old man, and I am tired. I wanted to believe that my family was the one place where I didn't have to look for the lie. I wanted to believe that my daughter had found the kind of partner I failed to be for her mother. But the numbers don't have feelings. They don't care about Sunday dinners or family photos. They just tell the truth. $300,000. That is not a mistake. That is not a loan. As I stood in my quiet kitchen, waiting for Sarah and Leo to come home, I realized I wasn't just a retired auditor anymore. I was a man with a target on his back, living in a house with a stranger who was wearing my son-in-law's face. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a legal loophole he was exploring for our benefit. This was a theft. It was a cold, calculated, and professional theft of a child's future. And the man who did it was coming home in 2 hours to have dinner with us. I went downstairs to dinner that night feeling like I had a loaded gun in my pocket. I knew the numbers. I knew about North Star Holdings. I knew that $300,000 of my grandson's future had vanished into thin air. But as I sat down at the mahogany table, looking at the roast chicken and the fine wine Mark had poured, I realized I was the only one who could see the cracks in the walls. Mark was holding court. He was telling a story about a land deal he closed on Friday, moving his hands with that easy confidence he has. Sarah was looking at him with so much pride it actually hurt to watch. And Leo, poor Leo, was just eating his mashed potatoes, completely unaware that his father was picking his pockets. I waited for a lull in the conversation. I took a slow sip of water, feeling the cool liquid hit my dry throat. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice as flat as a Kansas highway. "I was looking through some old bank records today, just trying to get my own house in order. I noticed a few transfers out of Leo's trust account, about $300,000 worth, going to a group called North Star. You recall authorizing those?" The room went quiet. Sarah stopped her fork halfway to her mouth. Leo looked up, sensing the change in the air. But Mark didn't even blink. He wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, leaned back, and gave me a look that was half smile, half pity. "North Star," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "Of course, Arthur. We discussed this last November, remember, over Thanksgiving. I told you we were moving a portion of the fund into a high-yield private equity group to beat the inflation rates. You were the one who told me to go ahead with it. You said you trusted my judgment." I felt the blood rush to my face. November 25th. We had sat on the porch. We talked about the weather. We talked about the turkey. We never talked about moving $300,000 into a shell company. "We never had that conversation, Mark," I said. "I think I would remember signing off on 60% of the fund." Mark sighed. It was a long, tired sound. He looked over at Sarah, then back at me. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned. That was the part that made my skin crawl. He looked like a man dealing with a difficult child. "Arthur, we spent an hour on it," he said softly. "You even asked me to bring the paperwork by your bedroom, because you said your eyes were tired. Sarah, honey, don't you remember? Dad was a little out of it that weekend. He kept forgetting where he put his glasses." Sarah looked at me and I saw it. I saw the doubt in her eyes. It wasn't doubt about Mark. It was doubt about me. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "Mark did mention something about a new investment. And you were a little forgetful that week. You left the stove on twice, remember? We talked about maybe having you see Eris for a checkup." I sat there, stunned. The stove, I had left a kettle on once because Leo called me into the yard to see a bird. One time. And now, they were using it to build a cage around me. "I am not forgetful, Sarah," I said. "I am an auditor. I don't forget $300,000. Mark, show me the North Star prospectus. Show me the quarterly returns. If it's a high-yield fund, there should be a paper trail." Mark shook his head slowly. "I'd love to, Arthur. But those are private offerings. The documents are at the office, under lock and key. I'll tell you what. Why don't you get some rest? You've been cooped up in this house too much. It's starting to play tricks on you." He reached across the table and put his hand on mine. His skin was warm. It felt like a snake. "We're family, Arthur," he whispered. "I would never do anything to hurt Leo. You know that, you're just tired. It happens to the best of us at your age." I pulled my hand away. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't looking at the bank records. She wasn't looking at the math. She was looking at my shaking hands. Shaking from pure, unadulterated, and she saw age. And she saw a father who was slipping away. I realized then that Mark was much more dangerous than a simple thief. A thief just takes your money. Mark was trying to take my mind. He was trying to take my standing in this family. He was building a narrative where every time I found a piece of the truth, it was just another sign of my growing dementia. The dinner finished in a suffocating silence. Mark helped Sarah clear the plates, acting like the perfect, supportive husband. He even offered to help me up the stairs. I told him I could manage just fine. I went into my room and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. My heart was racing. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I was an auditor who had found the crime. But the criminal had already convinced the jury that the investigator was crazy. I looked at the photo of Leo on my nightstand. Mark was betting on my silence. He was betting that I would be too embarrassed, too scared of being sent to a home, to keep digging. He thought he could bury me in the fog of old age. But he made one mistake. He thinks being old makes you weak. He forgot that being old means you have nothing left to lose but your honor. He isn't just stealing Leo's money anymore. He is stealing my voice. He is trying to erase the 40 years of work I put into this life. He wants to turn me into a ghost in my own hallway so he can finish his feast in peace. I picked up the phone. I knew one person who wouldn't care if I left the stove on. I knew one person who knew that my mind was as sharp as a razor, even if my knees creaked in the morning. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. "Frank," I said when the line picked up. "It's Arthur. I need a favor. And I need it off the books." I realized right then that I couldn't fight Mark in the dining room. I couldn't fight him with Sarah watching. He owned the house. He owned the narrative. To beat a man like Mark, I had to go back to the streets. I had to go where the paper trail turned into a dirt path. Because Mark might be a great lawyer, and he might be a perfect husband, but he is a terrible liar to someone who knows where the bodies are buried. He thinks he is playing a game of memory. He doesn't realize we are playing a game of survival. And I am far from finished. I parked my book 3 blocks away from the bookstore. I didn't want Mark's fancy German SUV passing by and seeing my car in front of Frank's place. In this town, people notice things. And Mark noticed everything. He had spent the last 2 years watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to trip over my own feet. Frank Ritchie's bookstore is a place where time goes to die. It smells like damp paper, stale coffee, and the kind of floor wax they stopped making in 1975. Frank is 70 years old. He spent 30 of those years as a private investigator, mostly chasing cheating spouses and skip bail cases. Now, he mostly chases dust bunnies and drinks cheap bourbon behind a counter of half-priced thrillers. I walked in, and the bell above the door gave a lonely little ring. Frank didn't even look up from his newspaper. "We're closed, Arthur," he said. "It's 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, Frank," I said. "Exactly," he replied, finally looking over his reading glasses. "Nobody buys books on a Wednesday. It's a day for contemplation and regretting your life choices. What brings you to this graveyard? You look like hell." I sat down on a creaky stool. "Frank, I need you to look into someone. Family." Frank's face changed. The lazy bookstore owner disappeared. And the man who used to find people who didn't want to be found came back. He reached under the counter, pulled out a bottle of Old Grand, Dad, and 2 plastic cups. He poured a finger in each and pushed one toward me. "It's always the ones closest to us, isn't it?" he muttered. "Is it the son-in-law?" The lawyer nodded. I told him everything. I told him about the yellow bank notice, the change of address, the $300,000 moved to North Star Holdings. I told him about the dinner, the gaslighting, and the way Sarah looked at me like I was losing my grip on reality. Frank listened without interrupting. He swirled the bourbon in his cup, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. When I finished, he didn't offer sympathy. Frank doesn't do sympathy. "North Star Holdings," he said, dragging out the words. "Sounds like a textbook shell company. I've seen a dozen of them. They exist on paper for 6 months, move a lot of cash, and then vanish like smoke. But Mark is a smart guy, Arthur. He's a professional. He wouldn't risk his license and his fancy house for a few $100,000 unless he was desperate." "That's what I don't get," I said. "He's a top-tier attorney. He makes good money. Why dig a hole in his own kid's future?" Frank leaned forward. "Men like Mark don't steal because they want a bigger TV, Arthur. They steal because they're already drowning. Give me a day. I still have a few friends who work the gray areas. If Mark is bleeding cash, there's a trail." I went home and played the part of the tired old man. I sat in my chair. I watched the news. I nodded when Sarah asked if I wanted tea. I watched Mark come home, kiss her on the cheek, and ask me how my afternoon walk was. He was so calm, so perfect. It made my stomach turn to think that he was waiting for my brain to rot so he could finish his work. The next morning, Frank called my cell phone. He didn't say hello. "Meet me at the diner on Route 9, he said. "The one with the broken sign minutes." When I got there, Frank was sitting in a back booth, a manila envelope resting next to a plate of cold toast. I sat down, and he pushed the envelope toward me. "Your son-in-law has a hobby," Arthur, Frank said, his voice low. "About 2 years ago, he started showing up at a private club over the county line. It's not a place you go to play $5 blackjack. It's a high-stakes room run by people who don't take IOUs from lawyers." "How bad is it?" I asked. Frank pointed at the papers. "From what my source tells me, Mark went on a cold streak that would make a statue cry. He lost his own savings first. Then he started borrowing. He owes people, Arthur, heavy people. The kind who don't care about his law degree. They just care about the vig." I flipped through the pages. There were photos. Grainy shots of Mark's car parked behind a warehouse late at night. There were bank records Frank had obtained through channels I didn't want to ask about. It showed Mark moving money from his firm's escrow accounts into his personal ones, just to cover the interest payments. "He's kidding," I whispered. My auditor's brain was screaming. "He's using Leo's trust to backfill the holes he's digging in his firm's accounts. It's a house of cards. It's worse than that," Frank said. "Look at the last page." I turned to a copy of a legal filing. It was a draft, not yet submitted. It was an application for emergency guardianship. It listed me as the ward. It cited 3 instances of reported cognitive decline and a recommendation for a full neurological evaluation. "He's going to use the law to lock me up," I said. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If he gets guardianship, he controls my testimony. He can say I'm incompetent and any evidence I bring up is just the ramblings of a sick man. Frank reached across the table and gripped my forearm. His hand was rough, like sandpaper, but it was the most solid thing I'd felt in weeks. "He's fast, Arthur. But he's arrogant. He thinks he's playing against a man who can't find his own shoes. He doesn't realize he's playing against a man who knows exactly how to tear down a crook bank." I looked at the photos of Mark. I thought about Sarah and Leo asleep in that house, protected by a man who was selling their lives away one chip at a time. The fear I had been carrying for days started to change. It wasn't gone, but it was being replaced by something else. Something cold and sharp. "I spent 40 years finding people like Mark," I said. "I spent 40 years putting them in rooms with no windows." Frank smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Good. Because a guy like this doesn't just stop. You have to break him. You have to take away his exit ramps." I picked up the envelope and stood up. "Frank, I need a list of everyone he owes. And I need to know who is running that club." Frank nodded. "I'll get it. But Arthur, be careful. You're not in a boardroom anymore. This is the street." I walked out into the bright morning sun. The air felt different. I wasn't just an old man trying to remember where I put my keys. I was an auditor on a live case. Mark thinks he's the hunter. He thinks he's just waiting for the clock to run out on me. He doesn't realize that I've spent my whole life looking at the fine print he thinks he's hiding behind. We weren't just talking about a trust fund anymore. We were talking about a man who was willing to destroy my daughter's life and my grandson's future to save his own skin. He was willing to put me in a cage to keep his secrets. I got into my book and turned the key. The engine turned over with a steady, reliable hum. Mark wants to play the long game. He wants to wait for me to fade away. But he's about to find out that some things don't fade. Some things just get sharper with age. And I wasn't just going to find the money. I was going to make sure he never had a place to hide again. I wasn't just going to get the money back. I was going to send him to prison. The silence in my house used to be a comfort. Now, it felt like a thick blanket of fog, hiding a cliff edge that I was walking toward with my eyes closed. I spent Friday morning sitting on the back porch, watching Sarah pack Leo's soccer gear into the car. Mark was already gone, heading to the city for what he called a high-stakes negotiation. He gave me that same pitying pat on the shoulder before he left, the kind you give a dog that's too old to fetch the ball anymore. Once their car disappeared down the driveway, I didn't go back to the computer. I knew what the numbers said. I needed to know what the man was thinking. I went to the side of the house where we keep the large rolling trash bins. It's a blue-collar habit I never lost. If you want to know what a business is hiding, you don't look at the front office. You look at what they throw away on a Friday morning. I dragged the heavy bin into the garage and pulled down the door. I put on a pair of work gloves. I started going through the bags. Most of it was typical. Grocery receipts, junk mail, scraps of Leo's homework. Then I found a bag from Mark's home office. It was heavy with shredded paper. In the bank we used cross-cut shredders that turned documents into confetti. Mark was lazy. He used a strip-cut shredder. He thought nobody would ever care enough to look. He thought he was living with a man who couldn't remember what he had for breakfast. I took the bag into my workshop in the basement. I cleared off my workbench, right next to the gears of a 1942 grandfather clock I was supposed to be fixing. I pared the strips out. I spent 3 hours with a roll of clear tape and a pair of tweezers. My back ached, my eyes burned. But I am an auditor. I have a patience that young men like Mark will never understand. I started matching the lines. Legal letterhead. A doctor's name I didn't recognize. Dr. Elias Vance. I kept taping. The words started to form. Emergency petition, involuntary commitment, assessment of cognitive impairment. My hands began to shake as the full picture came together. It wasn't just a plan to steal the money. It was a plan to erase the witness. Mark had already filled out the paperwork to have me declared a restricted person. He had a medical report from this Dr. Vance, a man I had never met, stating that I was suffering from advanced stage dementia and was a danger to myself and others. The date at the bottom was for this coming Monday, April 13, 2026. He wasn't going to wait for me to fade away. He was going to force it. On Monday morning, while Sarah was taking Leo to school, Mark was planning to have 2 men in white coats show up at my door. They would take me to the Cedar Creek Memory Care Center. It's a place out in the woods, 40 miles from here. A place where they keep the doors locked. Once I was inside, Mark would have full power of attorney. He would be the sole guardian of my estate, my testimony, and Leo's trust. He would kill my reputation to save his own skin. I sat there in the dim light of the basement, looking at those taped-together strips of paper. I felt a coldness in my bones that I can't describe. This man sat at my table. He watched movies with my grandson. He told my daughter he loved her. And all the while he was measuring me for a coffin that was still above ground. He was going to throw me into a hole and cover it with legal jargon. I stared at the name of the facility. Cedar Creek. I looked at the signature line where he had already signed as my next of kin. He was stealing my life while I was still using it. If you are listening to this, and you've ever worked a hard day's work to build something for your family, you know how this feels. You know the heat that starts in your gut when someone tries to tell you that your mind, your dignity, and your very freedom are items they can just trade away. It is a betrayal that goes deeper than money. It's an insult to every year you've spent on this earth. If you believe that a man's home should be his fortress, and that this kind of betrayal has no place in a family, I want you to stop for a second. Just leave a single word in the comments: justice. Write it down so I know you're standing there with me. Because what I'm about to do isn't just for the money anymore. I took a long, deep breath. I let the air out slowly, feeling the rage settle into something hard and sharp. I looked at the paper again. My hand was still trembling, but my mind had never been more clear. Mark thinks he's the only lawyer in the room. He thinks the law is a weapon that only he knows how to swing. He thinks because I have gray hair and a slow gait, I am a target that can't move. He's forgotten who I was before I was a grandfather. He's forgotten that I spent 40 years pulling apart men much smarter and much more dangerous than he will ever be. He wants to send me to a home on Monday. Fine. He wants to play with the legal system. I can do that too. But I'm not going to play by his rules. I'm going to use the one thing a gambler like Mark never expects. The truth, backed up by the kind of evidence that doesn't just win a case. It burns the whole house down. I carefully folded the reconstructed document and put it in my pocket. I went back upstairs. I heard the garage door open. Sarah and Leo were home. I heard Leo's laughter, that bright, innocent sound that Mark was willing to sell for a seat at a poker table. I walked into the kitchen and smiled at my grandson. I even gave Sarah a hug. I played the part of the quiet, tired old man for one more night. I let Mark come home and tell his lies over dinner. I let him look at me with that fake concern in his eyes. He thinks I'm the one being hunted. He thinks he's the one closing the trap. He has no idea that he's already stepped into my office. And the audit has just begun. He thinks I've forgotten how to fight. He's about to find out that I'm the one who wrote the book on how to take men like him apart. Monday is coming, Mark. But it's not going to be the day you think it is. I woke up on Saturday morning and decided to become the man Mark wanted me to be. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at the lines on my face, and I practiced the blank stare. I practiced the way a man looks when the fog is rolling in and he can't find the lighthouse. When I went down to the kitchen, Mark was already there, sipping his expensive coffee and reading the news on his tablet. He looked up and gave me that slow, calculating smile. "Morning, Arthur," he said. "Did you sleep okay? You seemed a little restless last night." I stood in the middle of the kitchen for 5 seconds too long. I let my jaw hang just a bit loose. I blinked, looking around like I didn't know where the coffee filters were. "The coffee," I muttered. "Sarah usually puts it in the blue tin." Mark's eyes lit up. It was a predatory look. He pointed to the white ceramic jar right in front of me. "No, Arthur, it's right here. It's been here for 12 years. "Oh," I said, shaking my head. "Right. 12 years. Of course." I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He was practically vibrating with relief. To him, this was proof that his plan for Monday was justified. He thought the old auditor was finally breaking down. He thought the witness was losing his voice. Later that morning, I told Sarah I was going to take a nap. Instead, I climbed out of the basement window, the same way Sarah used to sneak out when she was 16. I walked 2 miles to a gas station where Frank was waiting in a beat-up Ford that smelled like old cigars. We drove to a diner 30 miles away, far outside Mark's circle of influence. Waiting in a back booth was a man named Miller, no relation, who used to be the head of compliance at my old bank. Next to him was a young woman named Alina. She was an assistant district attorney who I had helped on a major embezzlement case back in 2015. I laid out the taped-together strips of the guardianship petition on the table. I showed them the records Frank had pulled on North Star Holdings and Mark's gambling debts. "He's moving," Fana said, her voice low and sharp. "If he files this on Monday, the court will appoint a temporary guardian immediately. You won't be able to sign a legal affidavit. You won't even be able to hire your own lawyer. You'll be a ward of the state under his control." I leaned forward. The old auditor's heart was beating steady now. "I'm not going to stop him from filing," I said. "I'm going to give him a reason to move even faster. I'm going to give him a way out that is actually a trapdoor." I explained the plan. Mark was drowning in debt. He needed one big score to clear the people who were breathing down his neck. I had an old dormant account from my days at the bank. Private investment vehicle I had kept for a rainy day. It had just enough in it to look like the answer to all his prayers. I was going to tell Mark that I had a secret stash of $400,000 in bearer bonds, but I couldn't remember the secondary access codes. I would tell him I needed him to help me organize the transfer on Sunday night so Sarah wouldn't find out. To get that money, he would have to sign a specific set of transfer documents as a co-trustee. Documents that Alina and my old bank colleague had drafted. They looked like standard investment papers, but hidden in the fine print of page 6 was a full admission of his fiduciary breaches and an acknowledgement that the North Star transfers were unauthorized loans he intended to repay. In his greed and his hurry to finish me off before Monday morning, he wouldn't read page 6. He would think he was just signing another piece of paper for the old man who couldn't find the coffee tin. "It's risky," Arthur Frank said, chewing on a toothpick. "If he catches on, he might skip the legal route and do something desperate." "He won't catch on," I said. "Arrogance is a blindfold. He thinks I'm a ghost. He thinks I'm already gone." I snuck back into the house before dinner. I spent the evening being the failing grandfather. I dropped my fork. I asked Leo the same question 3 times. I saw the look of pity on Sarah's face, and it nearly broke my heart. I wanted to hold her and tell her that her father was still here, but I couldn't. Not yet. If I blinked, Mark would see the steel behind my eyes, Before bed, I caught Mark in the hallway. I leaned in close, making my breath go a little shallow. "Mark," I whispered, I found something in the safety deposit box, beer bonds, from the '98 merger. 400,000, I think. I think I put them in the North Star folder, but the codes. I can't find the codes." Mark's entire body went stiff. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. $400,000. It was exactly what he needed to pay off the club and keep his law firm from collapsing. "Don't worry, Arthur," he whispered back, his voice thick with false kindness. "We'll look at it tomorrow night. Sunday, just you and me. We'll get it all sorted out before Monday. You just get some sleep. You've had a big day." He patted my arm. It was the pat of a man who thought he was putting a lid on a coffin. I went to my room and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew the layout of this house by heart. I knew every creak in the floorboards. Down the hall, I heard Mark on the phone, his voice hushed and excited. He was probably calling his creditors. He was probably telling them he'd have the cash by Tuesday. He thinks tomorrow is his payday. He thinks he's going to sign those papers, take the bonds, and then have me hauled away to Cedar Creek on Monday morning. He thinks he's won. But I spent 40 years looking at the things men hide in the shadows. I spent 40 years waiting for the one moment when a thief gets too comfortable. Sunday night dinner is going to be the last meal we have as a family. The house is quiet now, but the air feels charged, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Frank is in position. Elena has the warrant ready. The bank codes are set. Stage is set. The lights are down. All I have to do now is wait for the perfect son-in-law to take his seat at the table. He's about to find out that the man he's been trying to bury is the one who's been digging the hole. Stage is ready. The actor is coming, and I'm going to make sure he gets exactly the ending he deserves. Sunday night dinner was always the centerpiece of this house. Sarah had spent the afternoon roasting a prime rib, and the smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air. It was a smell that usually meant safety, but tonight, it felt like the heavy air before a tornado touches down. Mark was in a rare mood. He was jovial, expansive, pouring wine with a heavy hand. He kept looking at me, checking to see if I was still the vacant old man he'd seen all weekend. I played my part. I fumbled with my napkin. I let a little bit of gravy drip onto my shirt. I saw Mark catch Sarah's eye and give her a small, sad nod. He was reinforcing the lie, preparing her for the phone call he planned to make on Monday morning. After the plates were cleared, Leo went upstairs to finish his social studies project. Sarah went to the kitchen to start the coffee. Mark leaned in close to me. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single blue folder. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice thick with a kindness that made my stomach turn. "I went ahead and prepared those transfer documents for the bearer bonds we talked about. You know, the 400,000 you found. If we get this signed tonight, I can have the bank verify the codes first thing tomorrow. It'll be safe. You won't have to worry about forgetting where you put them ever again." He pushed a fountain pen toward me. It was an expensive pen, gold-nibbed. A lawyer's tool. I took the pen. My hand was shaking, but not for the reason Mark thought. I opened the folder. There were 3 pages. The first 2 were standard power of attorney forms. The third page was the one my friend Alina and the bank compliance officer had helped me slip into his office files earlier that afternoon while he was at the gym. "Mark," I said, my voice low. "My eyes are a bit blurry tonight. Can you read page 3 for me? Just to make sure I'm putting the bonds in the right place." Mark let out a short, impatient breath. He didn't even look at the text. He just skimmed it, his mind already on the gambling debts he was going to pay off. "It's just the standard liability waiver, Arthur. It says the funds are being moved to the secondary trust account under your full authorization. It's exactly what we discussed. Just sign at the bottom." I looked at him. I stopped shaking. I sat up straight, the way I used to when I was sitting across from a branch manager who'd been skimming the vault. "You're sure that's what it says, Mark?" "Because I'm looking at the second paragraph, and it seems to be an itemized list of every wire transfer made to North Star Holdings since last January. It also seems to include an admission that those funds were used to settle personal gambling debts at the Warehouse Club on Route 52. Mark's smile didn't vanish all at once. It froze. It turned into a mask of confusion. "Arthur, what are you talking about? You're getting confused again." Sarah came into the doorway holding a tray of coffee mugs. "What's going on?" Mark stood up, his face reddening. "Dad is having another episode, Sarah. He's talking nonsense about the bank again." "Arthur, give me the folder. You're not thinking clearly." I didn't give him the folder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I pressed play. The kitchen was filled with Mark's voice, but it wasn't the smooth, polished voice of a lawyer. It was the desperate, high-pitched voice of a loser. "I'll have the cash by Tuesday," the recording played. "I'm moving the last of the old man's trust tonight. He's half gone anyway. By the time he realizes the money is missing, he'll be locked in Cedar Creek and nobody will listen to a word he says. Just give me 48 hours. Sarah dropped the tray. The sound of breaking ceramic was like a gunshot. She stared at Mark, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. Mark turned toward her, his hands out. "Sarah. Honey, that's a fake. He's been tinkering with his old tapes. He's sick, Sarah. You know he's sick." I stood up. I didn't need a cane. I didn't need help. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the thick manila envelope Frank had given me. I threw it onto the table. It slid across the wood and hit Mark's wine glass. "Those are the originals, Mark," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. "The change of address forms you forge. The medical report from Dr. Vance, who I've already spoken to, by the way. He's quite worried about the fact that you used his letterhead to write a fake diagnosis for a man he's never met. And the last document in that blue folder. The one you just told me was a liability waiver." I pointed to the bottom of the page. Mark had already signed it as the co-trustee before bringing it to the table. "That's a notarized acknowledgement of debt. You just signed a confession, Mark, in front of a witness." I looked the doorway. Frank Ritchie walked in, followed by two men in dark suits. One was a detective I'd known for 20 years. The other was an investigator from the district attorney's office. Mark looked at the door, then back at the folder. He looked like a trapped animal. The charm was gone. The perfect suit seemed too big for him now. He looked small. He looked like a thief who'd finally run out of exits. "Sarah," he whispered. "I did it for us. I was going to put it back." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with a coldness that I'd never seen in her before. She looked like my daughter. "Get out of my house, Mark," she said. The detective walked forward. He didn't use any force. He didn't need to. Mark's knees had given out. He sat back down in the chair, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the house of cards he'd built was being blown away by a very old, very tired wind. They read him his rights right there in the dining room. I watched them put the cuffs on him. It wasn't the kind of scene you see in the movies. There was no shouting. Just the metallic click of the steel and the sound of Sarah's heavy breathing. As they started to lead him toward the front door, Mark stopped. He looked at me. There was no more pity in his eyes. There was only hate. "You think you won?" he spat. "You're still an old man, Arthur. You're still going to die alone in this house." I walked up to him. I was inches from his face. I could smell the expensive wine and the sore sweat of a man who'd lost everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just looked him in the eye, the way I'd looked at every liar who'd ever crossed my desk. I leaned in and whispered 4 words into his ear. "Audit's over, Mark. Leave." I watched them take him out to the car. The blue and red lights reflected off the windows of the house I'd worked 40 years to pay for. I went back into the kitchen. I picked up a broom and started helping Sarah sweep up the broken glass. We didn't talk. We didn't have to. The air was clear for the first time in years. The numbers were balanced. The witness wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time in my life, I felt like the debt was finally paid. It took 3 weeks for the dust to settle. 3 weeks of lawyers, depositions, and the kind of heavy silence that follows a house fire. Mark is gone. He is sitting in a county jail cell waiting for a trial that he can't charm his way out of. The bank fraud, the forgery, the unauthorized transfers. It is all on paper now. And as I have told you before, the math does not lie. The house feels bigger now. Quieter, but in a good way. The fog that Mark tried to wrap around me has lifted. I can walk through my own kitchen without feeling like a ghost. I can look at the coffee tin and know exactly why it is there. Sarah took it hard at first. She stayed in her room for 3 days after the arrest. I didn't push her. I just left plates of food outside her door and kept Leo busy in the garage. There is no manual for how to tell your daughter that the man she loved was a wolf. You just have to wait for the fever to break. On the 4th day, she came out. Her eyes were red, but she looked steady. She sat down next to me on the back porch. We didn't talk about the money or the prison time. We just watched the sunset hit the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I almost let him take you away." I reached over and took her hand. My skin is wrinkled and spotted, and hers is still smooth, but we are made of the same stuff. I spent 40 years being a father who provided everything but himself, I told her. You wanted a family that was perfect, 'cause I was never there to show you how a real one works. This isn't on you, Sarah. It's on the man who thought he could use our love as a weapon. We are moving forward. I helped her find a good estate lawyer. one who actually follows the law. We clawed back about $200,000 from the North Star accounts before they were drained completely. It isn't the whole 500,000, but it is enough. Yesterday, I went to the bank. I didn't go as a victim or an old man looking for a handout. I went as Arthur Miller. I sat in a bright office and signed the paperwork to move the remaining funds into a new, ironclad trust for Leo. This time, there are 3 independent trustees. Professional ones. I am one of them, but I made sure that if I ever do start to slip, the boy's future is still locked behind a door that no son-in-law can open. It is a strange thing, getting your dignity back. It doesn't feel like a big celebration. It feels like putting on a pair of old work boots that finally fit right again. I am 68 years old. I might have 10 years left, or I might have 20. But whatever time I have, it belongs to me. It doesn't belong to a medical report or a guardianship petition. I spent most of this morning in the backyard with Leo. We were fixing the fence. It is simple work. You measure, you cut, you nail the boards into place. Grandpa, Leo asked, holding a box of galvanized nails. Is Dad ever coming back? I stopped hammering and looked at him. He has his mother's eyes. I had to tell him the truth, not the ugly details but the truth. Your dad made some very bad choices, Leo. He hurt people he was supposed to protect. For a long time, he won't be able to come here. But you have your mother, and you have me, and this house isn't going anywhere. He nodded, satisfied with that, and went back to work. He trusts me. That is a heavy thing, trust. It is easy to break and damn near impossible to fix once it's gone. I spent my whole career looking at people who broke it for a few extra zeros in a bank account. I'm glad that's not how my story ends. The sun is going down now. The shadows are long across the grass. Sarah is in the kitchen starting dinner. The smell of frying onions is drifting through the screen door. It is a good smell. It is the smell of a home that has been scrubbed clean. I know there are plenty of men out there my age who feel like the world is trying to push them into a corner. They tell us we're too slow, or too old, or that we don't understand how things work anymore. But they're wrong. We see things they don't. We know that a man's word is his bond, and that family is the only thing worth fighting for until the very last bell rings. I saved my grandson's future, but in a way I saved my own too. I proved that I'm still here. I'm still the auditor. And as long as I'm breathing, I'll be standing at the gate. If you've stuck with me through this whole story, I appreciate you listening. It means a lot to know there are people who still value things like loyalty and standing up for what's right. If you enjoyed this journey with Arthur, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us tell more stories like this one. Stories about the things that really matter in this life. The audit is closed. The books are balanced. And for the first time in a long time, I think I'll sleep just fine tonight. Take care of yourselves and keep a sharp eye on the fine print. Good night.